Could we all please sit? Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Songezo Mabete, the official program director for today. I am employed as legal counsel at the Competition Commission, and as has become custom, it is indeed a pleasure to be standing before you today. 891 days ago, officially, the President, for the first time, on 23rd of March 2020, addressed the nation. It was not a State of the Nation address. It was an address unprecedented for most of us, if not for all. Then, the President confirmed that the nation would go into lockdown. None of us knew what that word meant. Certainly none of us knew what the implications of those words meant. And the world stood still, if even briefly. In the intervening period to now, the world has lost 6.49 million people. South Africa has lost 102,000 people. And of all of what I've said, one word is the common denominator: COVID. In this room, there are many whose lives have changed irrevocably. They went home to mom and dad one day. On another, there was no mom and dad. Wives, husbands, children. The world between the 23rd of March 2020 to now, for many, if not, I dare say, for all times, has changed. We would see midday reports every day coming from the government, letting the people know what COVID was. We learned anew the basic concepts of hygiene. We adopted different ways of living. Social distance became physical distance, became emotional distance. For many, became loneliness. It cannot be lost on anybody here now just how privileged we all are by our mere presence here today. Whoever your God is, it probably would be due, if you haven't already, be thankful to that deity of yours. The Commission has been impacted, the Tribunal no less, our friends and external stakeholders. Minister Patel himself has lost a comrade. Who can forget the quiet poise of one Jackson Mthembu, who was in our homes a lot of the time, giving us briefs. There were emails circulating within the organization, letting us know how to conduct ourselves, encouraging us to make contact with each other. I was living alone at the time, and anything could have happened. A lot has changed since. Not necessarily for me, but for you at home. It was also a time for riches and blessings. One became two, and two became three. There are many new faces here that, Mr. Commissioner, are now our colleagues. We are thankful for them and their contribution. And so, equally, for the first time since 2019, the Commission, the Tribunal, the CAC, and their respective friends meet for the 16th Annual Competition Law, Economics and Policy Conference. I think just on that, it's a good time to be thankful and give each and every single one of us in this room a round of applause. The time is 9:30. Understandably, the greetings took longer than usual. It's not something we do quite often. Many of us are wearing suits and ties for the first time. Many are wearing makeup for the first time in a while. And of course, I have to say, Mr. Commissioner, we have a beautiful staff complement. Mr. Commissioner, although that title is living on borrowed time, it is an honor to once again be standing here today and reminisce of times past. It feels good to be in each other's company, and it remains a singular honor for me, in the presence of these men and women, to welcome you on stage to give us the official opening address of this very august occasion, as we once again come together and brainstorm the ideas of law of economics in the context of competition regulation in South Africa.
Are we talking on the mic on this? Thank you. This is quite a big pulpit. Minister Ibrahim Patel, Chair of the Competition Tribunal and members of the tribunal. I don't know if there are justices of courts who are here, but if they are acknowledged. We did invite some for various sessions. I'd like to acknowledge them. Heads and representatives of the competition authorities across the world, my colleagues and leadership of the Competition Commission, the incoming commissioner, Doris Tsepe, members of the legal profession, and various experts in their various guises and groupings, our international guests. I'd like to welcome all of you and acknowledge your presence. I also want to really extend a special word of welcome to our former colleague and dear friend Dave Lewis. I'm so glad, Dave, that you could make it to the session. You know, we don't meet quite often, and Songezo is correct. We have not met for quite a while after COVID, so we've not seen people. So I think I'd like to join Songezo in celebrating all of you. It's good to see you after so long. There's a lot of excitement, and people didn't want to come into the hall in the morning because they were still greeting. So we've been through quite a lot, and I think we should really use this next 2 days to reconnect and celebrate. There are many. I think the program is less hectic than it usually is, although it's it covers a variety of topics. We've kept it a little bit relaxed because we are reintroducing you to conferencing, so we don't want to be shocked that you have forgotten all. I actually was not sure how to handle today, but it said that the French philosopher Voltaire, when he was on his deathbed, and he had, I did have one of the commission staff when I was coming in to consult with them on a case. He said, "Oh, well, welcome the newly departed commissioner." So apparently Voltaire's disciples came to him when he was on his deathbed and said to him, "Well, master, it is time to exorcise the devil." And Voltaire looked very worried and said to them, No. This is not the right time to make enemies. So I will not talk about anything that will make enemies today. I can assure you that. Firstly, I do want to thank a few people before I get into the business of what we are going to do today. I want to firstly really acknowledge and thank the minister. He has been a consistent supporter of not just me, but the commission and the competition authorities throughout my term and I suppose his term. He has pretty much attended all our conferences, I think, and I can't think of any minister who had done that before, except the year that it fell on Ramadan. So thanks very much, Minister, for this. But also he has placed competition policy at the center of his economic agenda, which is also something rare. It's rare in South Africa for sure, but it's also rare around the world. I know that perhaps this is changing. We're seeing a lot of focus in this area from President Biden in the US and across Europe. Here in Africa, we're also seeing a lot of countries adopting competition policy. But I can say without any doubt that Minister Patel was a pioneer in this modern era in recognizing the central role of competition policy in economic growth and development. And I think this has been now widely acknowledged by even international organizations such as the OECD, World Bank, and so on. So I'd like to really thank him for this. I know that we do have a farewell dinner later on where we might get a chance to speak. I also want to, and I'm sorry, Dave, I don't want to put you on the spotlight, but I think Dave is probably, I can't think of any person who has advanced the work on really understanding single firm conduct, the damage that single firm conduct causes. We know that in competition law, we're all very excited, myself included, about cartel enforcement, about all of these things, and they are important. But I think Dave, more than anyone else I know, has really awakened the world on the dangers of a single firm conduct, dominant firm conduct, particularly from a perspective of developing countries. And I know not all his judgments have been upheld in this respect, but the theoretical framework of what he left as a legacy is something that we really are grateful for. Again, we're seeing that there are people who are advancing this work now quite a lot, and quite impressed that Europe is really focused on dominant firms, particularly focusing on digital markets. And we are, in this respect, in good company, but we are also pioneers. I also want to take the opportunity to also acknowledge our international counterparts who have walked this path with us. And I'm very glad that Professor Eleanor Fox from NYU can join us also for this conference for today and tomorrow, because I think she probably single-handedly represent the collective goodwill that as authorities in South Africa received from the time that we were established. So thanks very much, Eleanor, and you know what you've also done during my term. I want to acknowledge that. We will continue with these acknowledgements, as I have said, because we have other platforms dinner tonight to do so. I do want to take also a little bit of time introducing Doris. I know you are all interested in this. And by the way, one of the things I didn't say in thanking Minister Patel is just how well he has handled the transition at the Commission. I think it's very rare for this type of a handover that we are having with Doris, and we're grateful for that. So we have government has announced. We know that government has announced Doris, and Doris is not new to us. So I take the opportunity to welcome her. I worked with Thompson before. I also worked with her again at the Commission. We had quite a notorious case involving a fertilizer cartel. It first presented itself as an abuse of dominance case. And when I went to the Commission, I remember this case was handled by Nomfundo Maseti, who is now with NERSA. And the economics team and the Commission was not keen to take this case. I won't bore you with the details of it, but what you had essentially was an arrangement amongst fertilizer producers, LAN, which is a nitrogenous fertilizer used mainly for maize and wheat, grains like that. They had arranged that the local producers would produce enough such that there would be no need for imports. And if there were imports, they would agree through an arrangement of ownership of import facilities how much imports will come into the country. And we were pursuing this case against Sasol as an abuse case. And as we were pursuing it, it became clear that it also included an agreement of sorts, not exactly to fix prices, but to take the surplus out of the market. So through overland exports, excess fertilizer would be sold to neighboring countries, and that would keep supply and demand under check locally. As I said, through that case, we realized that we had a wrong economics team at the time. So we got in Doris to also help us with this, and we pursued the cartel case. I know that we had at that time Simon Roberts had subsequently joined, rescued the economics team, and we had I think Wendy Mkwananzi is not here, who was at Legal Services working with me. We got Sasol to approach us for a settlement, and we know that their counsel had opposed this position, but we got a 250 million fine and an admission from Sasol on the cartel, and a commitment to divest from retail to address the abuse of dominance element in the case. This case probably, in my view, more than any other, illustrates the intersection of various areas of competition law. A lot of people think that you can recognize a cartel when you see it, or an abuse of dominance when you see it. But we learned through this case that actually often it is naive of us to want to characterize the case before we actually know what happened, what really was the intention of the parties. In this case, it was restricting supply and demand in the market, which essentially looked like a cartel, which it was, but it was also reinforcing a dominance of one player. And so when we think about cases, we have to think of them beyond thinking about them as either vertical or horizontal agreements, because they could be a combination. I think what's more important is the intention of the parties on what they do. And so through this case, Doris and many people at the commission, I think, did establish quite a strong bond in the relationship that has been lasting up until now, that she has been most recently, still is a panel member of the Digital Markets Inquiry, again demonstrating this connection between the commission and her. So it is true that Doris comes from outside the commission. It's also true that she has been intimately involved with our casework for quite some time. So welcome, Doris, and good luck. I also want to, I spoke to a few colleagues about what to say, and I think they all agree that one doesn't speak about his own legacy. It is for you to interpret it the way you want, or discard it. What I want to do, though, because I think it's quite important, is to just say that institutions matter. And I think if we have messed up cases at the Commission, getting wrong decisions here and there, judgments against us here and there, that would be fine. It also would have been fine if we didn't always get it 100% in our various targets, you know, as long as it is within reason, so that you are not held before a disciplinary committee for incompetence. But it would have been fine not to meet these targets 100%. But I think it would have been disastrous if we had failed to create an institution that can be trusted by its stakeholders. And I don't want to count all of you. You all know yourselves as stakeholders. And that you are here today really is something that I appreciate, because it also confirms that whatever we have done, you know, we could have scratched each other here and there. After all, this is a litigious environment. But we have institutions we can trust. They make decisions that we know are informed by either legal consideration or economic considerations. They are institutions with integrity. They are institutions that we can submit our complaints to without worries. They are institutions we can be proud to litigate for, but they are also institutions we are not afraid to litigate against. And I think that system we have created together is something to be truly proud of. And in this respect, I'm again going to go to our predecessors who, from a policy point of view, foresaw the need to create these independent institutions to enforce this mandate, but also those who were there in the beginning to start the work of putting together the institutions. I think that it is their legacy that we are celebrating today. Of course, it is important that we acknowledge that the legitimacy of institutions and the continued trust by stakeholders is, at least in part, dependent on how they respond to the needs of these stakeholders. And so I'm not downplaying by any means performance. All I'm saying is that it will be for others to assess this aspect. I'm quite proud that we are handing over an institution which is beyond its teen years, a young adult who is ready to take on the world. We have a fine institution. And at this point, I think that is all that matters. But we do have people who came here with expectations that we will talk a little bit about the work, I would refer you to the program. It is exciting. Just maybe I will take about 5 minutes before I conclude, putting into perspective a few things. The first is, I think what we've seen with the competition authorities in the past 2 or 3 years, I don't know now when exactly COVID struck, but what we've seen with the competition authorities is an almost immediate and natural role of defending consumers, of protecting consumers. And you would have seen that with whether it's cases around food prices, cases around PPE, price gouging, and things like that. And that's building into a theme of protecting consumers from exploitative pricing, which we saw with the data market inquiry and the outcomes of that. So that's one area. The second area has been the theme of opening up markets. So whether it is the work we have done in the retail market inquiry that sought to break down barriers to entry for SMMEs, HDI-owned firms to get into shopping mall spaces without restrictions, not only as full competitors to retailers, but also as specialty stores, you know, your grocery, your sort of fresh produce, things like butcheries and so on within the shopping malls. You will see that theme running through to market inquiries. You will also see it running through major conditions. I am only here to admit that it was deliberate. You will also see a third theme, that of really trying to infuse the normative values of the Constitution into the work that we do as competition authorities. You would have seen recent cases on this. We had the Constitutional Court in Matlosana Mediclinic judgment, and I'm glad that that work is being advanced also at the CAC now. So looking at constitutionalism beyond the process, but also on the content of what we do. I think that we are at the very early stages of many of these things, and it is probably premature to declare success. I will not talk about the challenges. I think many of you are aware of. I wanted to put that context. Let me, in my conclusion, say that I don't really know why I want to leave the commission, but we have this, the people thought it was a joke, but it's actually through this, that the problem with commission people is that whenever they leave, they want to come back. So I tell them that they must be very, very careful before they decide to resign, because when they want to come back, normally we ask them to go through the process, and they don't always succeed because we would have to take the best candidate. So it's been a pleasure to be here, and I won't look back. You know, I am just allow me also, because I know that not all my colleagues might make it to dinner, to also acknowledge we've had quite a stable institution over time with very stable management, and I think that this is due not just my presence at the Commission, but also the leadership that has been provided by our management committee, the commitment of our staff to our cases, to our cause. So I'd like really to pay homage to them, to really acknowledge all the work that I have tried to highlight today. It's really credit to them. The rest of you, I will still acknowledge you, as I have said, at the dinner tonight. Thanks very much and welcome to the conference.
Londi, where your task is to make sure that the Commissioner's details do not leave the system, lest he might want to come back. But I don't know how that's going to happen, because we don't have titles for such, and I don't know if the government arrangement allows. For instance, when Prince Buthelezi left the IFP's presidency, they simply made him President Emeritus. Archbishop Tutu left the church, Archbishop Emeritus Tutu. Sis Doris, I don't know if you are comfortable with the title of Commissioner Emeritus in your organization, but it remains nonetheless a possibility. The least you can do is gear yourself for something like that. I don't know why equally the Commissioner did not call the minister up. I've never had the honor and the privilege to call a minister up on stage. Who is me, a mere legal counsel at the Commission? But if this is a prophecy of any kind, Mr. Commissioner, I certainly do receive it. Mr. Patel, please come and address your people.
Commissioner Thembinkosi Bonakele, as well as incoming Commissioner Doris Tsepe and staff of the Commission, Chair of the Competition Tribunal, Mondo Mzwai, and members of the Tribunal, members of the Competition Appeal Court, competition regulators and practitioners from other African countries, from BRICS countries, from the European Union, and from the United States, members of the legal fraternity and eminent senior counsel who's with us today, practitioners in the economics profession, many colleagues that I have worked with over the years. I was really pleased to see Dave Lewis, Eleanor Fox, Simon Roberts, and many, many others. Ladies and gentlemen, today marks the opening of the 16th Competition Conference and also the changing of the guard. Thembinkosi Bonakele is stepping down as Commissioner after 9 groundbreaking years at the helm and many more years in shaping the work of the Commission. And Doris Tsepe is taking over the baton for the next phase of the work of the Commission at a critical point in competition policy. Thembinkosi, of course, has had an exceptional period as Commissioner, helping to redefine the way the Commission works, energizing it, placing it at the center of the national conversation. Doris is a talented, experienced professional who we are very pleased to have attracted to the post. At dinner tonight, we will be able to pay a fitting tribute to Thembi Nkosi, and to welcome Doris to her new responsibilities and to introduce her a little bit more formally. I hope I will see all of you there tonight, share a meal, and celebrate and toast these two proud South Africans. It's been 3 years since we met like this. 2019, when we last convened a competition conference in person. And our world, as our MC said, has changed significantly. Let me take you back to June 2019, just about a month and a half, 2 months prior to the last in-person conference. The country had just emerged from a period of state capture that has caused serious damage to institutions, to growth, to the well-being of South Africans. Though, of course, the hard work of gathering the evidence and prosecuting the wrongdoers was still to lie ahead. Following the most far-reaching reform of our Competition Act since the 1998 Act was promulgated, a number of amendments had just been passed by Parliament and signed into law by the President at a ceremony in Cape Town. And in his SONA address of that year, he lifted the importance of competition law in contributing to economic development goals. The newly elected President of the Republic, fresh from an election, addressed the nation in June of 2019, and there was a palpable sense of optimism as he set out a vision of growing the economy founded on what he termed a reimagined industrial strategy, to reignite growth and industrialization, to support green industries, to increase investment in infrastructure, to adapt the economy to the opportunities arising from the fourth industrial revolution, and to expand trade and investment linked to implementing of an African continental free trade area. It was an ambitious vision, yes, and it provided a clear sense of where policymakers would focus their efforts. That was in June 2019. Now, on that day in June 2019, or indeed at the competition conference that took place shortly thereafter, imagine that I had to tell you that over the next 3 years, we would experience a number of unexpected events. Imagine that I said first that the world would face the biggest global pandemic since 1918, with a virus that would cause millions of deaths worldwide, shut down businesses, require all of us to wear masks and walk around with bottles of 70% alcohol to rub onto our hands, that it would lead to the sharpest recession since the Second World War, and start a process of disruptions to global supply chains that would cause policymakers to think and to rethink quite fundamental elements of economic policy. Imagine that I had to say, secondly, that South Africa would be rocked by the largest unrest since the start of democracy, following an ex-president being sent to jail, that the unrest would cause damage to physical and commercial infrastructure and lead to significant loss of lives, and that, by the way, it would happen just 6 months after an attempted insurrection in the United States, with supporters of an outgoing American president trying to take control of the United States Capitol building. Imagine further that I would say, third, that there would be a war in the heart of Europe, with a nuclear-armed protagonist on the one side and nuclear-armed supporters on the other side. That the one country would be shut out of the global financial system, that Europe's supply of energy would be threatened, that a sharp rise in fuel and food prices would affect, among many others, South Africans. And incidentally, that I would also say and add that the spike in oil prices would be just 2 years after oil prices had reached their lowest levels yet, and at one point oil producers would pay people to take the oil from them. Imagine finally that I was to tell you that the dangers of climate change would show itself in the largest floods in living memory on South Africa's eastern seaboard, washing away lives, livelihoods, housing, and parts of our main freight goods train artery between the country's largest port and its industrial heartland, and that it would take place in the same year that temperatures reached record highs in other parts of the world. If anyone had to offer these predictions, they may have been thought of as a couple of sandwiches short of a picnic. But they illustrate how much has taken place since the last in-person competition conference just 3 years ago. I know you would all want a less eventful next 3 years. These disruptions have been accompanied by other developments that have heightened the complexity in our world, the complexity we have to deal with. And we've also had some new developments on the competition policy front. The economic, geopolitical, and technological rivalry between the United States and China has intensified in the past few years. And significantly, it's continued beyond the term of the previous US administration. It's become mainstream in the US. It's been heightened further by tensions relating to the territory of Taiwan. Major corporations and policymakers are now focused on de-risking supply chains. In the European Union, the policy framework of what the EU has termed strategic autonomy has been given an additional impetus by the challenges experienced during COVID-19, and there appears to be a number of efforts by Europe to quietly build its own supply chains in key product lines. The shortage of semiconductors is a striking example of a new strategic industrial policy that's emerging in a number of countries. The shortage, based on rising demand for chips in, among others, cars and electronic products, coupled with a reduced supply caused by supply chain disruptions, has led to extraordinary levels of public subsidies and incentives being developed across the world, ranging from the US, China, the EU, Japan, India, and South Korea. It has also reduced the output of South Africa's own car industry, with some plants facing longer shutdown periods in South Africa than they experienced during even the first wave of COVID-19 lockdowns. The pandemic laid bare the vulnerability faced by South Africa and the African continent in securing access to basic medical goods. Let me step back from the detail and reflect on the implications of this new reality on competition policy. We have arguably reached an inflection point, and faced with these many challenges: disrupted global value chains, the rise of big tech and the GAFAs, high levels of global inequality, geopolitical tensions, and climate change pressures. And the question is, what does competition policy offer to the world in dealing with these crises? The old paradigm of the Chicago School is under pressure even in the United States. The Chicago School fundamentally shaped the way in which competition policy has been viewed in most countries for many decades now, deftly shifting the focus of the original US antitrust policies. The pendulum may be swinging away from the Chicago School and from its doctrine that chained the mandate of competition policy to the test of consumer welfare, where only price and quantity are taken into account, and in which the competitive process, including entry of new small firms and innovation, are ignored. The doctrine contributed, no doubt, to increased concentration and arguably deindustrialization, on the Faustian bargain that the loss of economic inclusion and production is worth the benefits of choice and prices. The work of Lina Khan, the current chair of the Federal Trade Commission on the Amazon paradox, challenged the idea that this approach to consumer welfare was a sufficient or indeed principal lens through which competition policy should be viewed. The recent focus by Jonathan Kanter, the head of the US Department of Justice Antitrust Unit, on the challenges posed by private equity firms during multiple acquisitions that relate to each other in ways that are not immediately apparent in each separate merger transaction, will be watched with great interest across the world and bears further thought. South Africa, of course, had our own experience of Bain Capital taking over the Edcon Group in 2007 and saddling it with significant debt, with the country's largest clothing retailer eventually bleeding to death. Shocks, however hard they hit us, are often the prelude to new insights in society. Disruption can inspire innovation. The question is, how will we as South Africans respond? Can we de-risk so that we reduce our exposure to the downside and increase our exposure to the upside of a world that is rapidly changing? At home, we can remain trapped by the short term, wrapped in gotcha politics and fighting over a small cake, a zero-sum race to the bottom. Or we can look up and beyond and see how the world is changing, which will allow us to shift drastically and build a real consensus on the hard choices, and with discipline and focus, grow the economy inclusively so that it can create jobs and opportunities for young people and in a way that shares rather than concentrates wealth. Disruption has reaffirmed the need to move with speed in finalizing the implementation modalities of the African Continental Free Trade Area, what we call the AfCFTA. Considerable work has been done, and a package of rules of origin which defines the level of African value add required for each product to benefit from preferential trade has been finalized, covering now several thousand products and 88% of the tariff book. Last month, trade ministers across the continent finalized this package with an approach that concluded the deal on sugar and tobacco. Discussions are now ongoing on protocols on competition, on intellectual property, and on investment protection. The focus of discussion on a competition protocol is currently on what should be the level of ambition and its scope, and how can such a protocol and should it impact on national and regional competition authorities. In particular, the matters that have come up in discussion relate to how best to deal with cross-border cartels and with the regulatory challenges posed by global online services. It has proven to be very hard for national authorities to curb global malpractice, particularly in the context of the digital economy, where the source of the service can be located anywhere. At home, the Competition Commission is considering how best to address some of these challenges through the market inquiry on online and digital markets. Its analysis of the market and common practices is thought-provoking. Its proposed measures seek to address particular conduct in some ways specific to this market. And I look forward to your views and, of course, the final report of the Commission. South Africa was, on some accounts, an outlier in competition policy in 1998. Now, in many jurisdictions, they are recognizing the value of a more appropriate competition policy with this wider lens. You see it coming up in so many different ways, not always in its own name. And so the outlier may be the pioneer. Our competition regime blends traditional competition concerns with development outcomes appropriate for South Africa. Not an off-the-shelf, not a cut and paste, but something customized to the reality of a country. Our competition policy aims to address high levels of economic concentration and promote effective competition that supports industrialization, builds dynamic firms, protects and creates jobs, and promote economic inclusion and transformation. The economy remains characterized by what is still a racially skewed spread of ownership and high levels of economic concentration and exclusion. Concentrated markets tend to inhibit new entrants, to limit investment and employment, and to stifle innovation. Dominant firms are able to charge higher prices and exclude rival firms, disadvantaging customers which pay more for inferior quality products and reducing the competitiveness of the economy. This results in increased imports, depriving the local economy from expanding industrial outputs and jobs. Our competition policy provides a range of tools to increase competitive dynamism, including through regulation of mergers and acquisitions, to tackle high concentration and abusive behavior by dominant companies, to proactively open markets and develop a more inclusive and transformed economy, and to advance the public interest. And these are complemented by other industrial policy tools like industrial support and trade policy. The challenge of what we need to do as a country can't be on the shoulders of competition policy alone. In a number of studies on the South African economy, there's a growing concern about high levels of concentration and the impact thereof upon viable competitive process and the enhancement of welfare. By market or economic concentration, of course, I mean the extent to which a small number of firms account for the overwhelming share in a given market. I guess, perhaps, you could say that this high level of concentration started in 1652 with a monopoly. A monopoly, the Dutch East India Company, or to use its proper name, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, the VOC. It was a private corporate entity, the result of, by the way, a government-directed consolidation or merger of a number of rival trading companies. It was a vast conglomerate with its own private army, merchant ships, and significant colonial territory under its control. Google would be jealous. Under apartheid, concentration manifested itself through the dominance of conglomerates in the economy. By 1990, 6 corporates controlled 84% of the JSE. Anglo, Rembrandt, Sanlam, Old Mutual, Liberty, and Anglo-Val. The struggle against apartheid had at its core a vision of a more inclusive society and economy. The Freedom Charter adopted in 1955 and an inspiration for our Constitution says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that the people shall govern. And it also says that the people shall share in the country's wealth, and that the land shall be shared among those who work it. And these are connected visions. They go as a package. Speaking at the Options for Building an Economic Future conference in May 1990, not yet president at the time, Nelson Mandela, who was a fierce non-racist, who passionately believed in a non-racial democracy, remarked, and I quote him, "If we are genuinely interested in ending the old social order and bringing in a new one characterized by the notions of justice and equity, it is quite obvious that the economic power relations represented by the reality of the excessive concentration of power in a few white hands have to change. We make this demand not as a result of any imperative that might be said to derive from ideological convictions. We make it because we cannot see how it could be possible to pull our country out of the economic crisis, in part caused and exemplified by this control of economic power, while at the same time we perpetuate this power structure." End of quote. This approach inspired the Reconstruction and Development Program that was the basis for the governance program of the first democratic administration and informed the development of the Competition Act. While conglomerates have been largely dismantled, concentration remains. This is the finding in arguably one of the most significant public documents released in the past 12 months, the report on measuring concentration and participation in the South African economy, its levels and trends. And I really would like to congratulate the Commission for an excellent piece of work. The report is really a who owns the South African economy. It sets out the firms that produce what you eat, where you shop, where you go for your medicines, your blood tests, your x-rays, what you read, what you drink or smoke, or where you gamble if you do, what you drive or you fly with, the pipes for the water we use, renewable energy, and also the coal, your insurance, your retirement fund, your medical aid, and who you bank with. The study found that of the 144 subsectors of the economy with sufficient data, over 2/3 were highly concentrated, 21% were moderately concentrated, and just less than 10% had unconcentrated markets. An examination of trends over the last 10 years for these subsectors found that the industries that are highly concentrated are more likely to see further increases in levels of concentration. Industries with dominant firms were 3 times more likely to face increased concentration rather than decreasing concentration or constant concentration levels. Almost 2/3 of oligopolistic markets were not becoming less concentrated. It found that the number of SMMEs was growing, but that they face increasing exit rates and have a comparatively low share of value add. The analysis of the SARS administrative tax data showed that while 95% of firms in 2016 were SMMEs, that's a very big proportion, together they only accounted for 24% of turnover. In contrast, large firms made up only 5% of all firms, yet comprised 76% of total turnover. Our high levels of concentration and inequality are comparatively high relative to OECD countries, where SMMEs make up 99% of business and generate between 50 and 60% of value add. There were high degrees of inequality in the distribution of firm income. Again, using the SARS administrative tax data set, the study revealed that high levels of inequity in the distribution of firm turnover was present across the economy, with the largest 10% of firms averaging, call it 86% of all firm turnover. It calculated a Gini coefficient for the distribution of firm turnover in the economy at 0.837, which is much higher than the coefficient measuring inequality in household expenditure. A number of subsectors in the economy have a coefficient that is 0.8 or higher, with the exception of sectors where SMMEs typically thrive. So you see a direct correlation. And finally, the report drew particular concerns arising in the agriculture value chain, the commercial agriculture value chain. It said that while the commercial agriculture value chain should offer opportunities for participation, it should be easy to get into it. From 2015 to 2019, there was a 24% decline in the number of commercial grain farmers, a 31% decline for commercial dairy farmers, and a 56% decline for commercial livestock farmers. This decline threatens efforts to bring in small emerging farmers who face difficulties in transitioning to scalable business. High concentration levels, of course, have many drivers and causes. In part, pre-democracy government policies, but also strategic barriers to entry created by incumbents, including companies that were privatized but gained huge market share prior thereto by virtue of state largesse. Low rates of business formation, the small size of the domestic market, and perhaps in some cases mergers and acquisitions. Concentration at the levels observed in South Africa is not adequately explained by improvements in efficiency, nor is it the case, nor is it in many cases driven by innovation. A number of studies of the South African economy, including studies by the World Bank and the OECD, have pointed to this unusually high levels of market concentration. The World Bank's report, An Incomplete Transition, Overcoming the Legacy of Exclusion in South Africa, notes the following. It says, competition issues in South Africa are reflected in the large dispersal of rates of return to capital across sectors, with some exhibiting very high markups. Substantial market power in those sectors is likely to result in suppressed demand for capital and labor, low total factor productivity, keeping poorly competitive firms in business, and reduced price competitiveness for sectors that use as inputs the inflated goods and services produced in concentrated sectors. Markups above normal profits are estimated to amount to close to 10% of GDP in South Africa. I mean, that is an astonishing finding. The World Bank then goes on to say if markup rates were to be progressively halved by 2030, investment would pick up by 10% on the baseline, in line with the new investment opportunities, as do exports by 9% with increased competitiveness, resulting in the creation of an additional 405,000 jobs and higher real wages. Inequality would be reduced as capital owners, mainly concentrated in the richest decile, would see their real disposable income grow less rapidly than poorer deciles, with the Gini coefficient at 58.8 by 2030. With cheaper goods and higher labor incomes, the poverty rate would also be reduced by 11%, lifting an additional 1.1 million people out of poverty. That's from the World Bank study. Now, I cite these to make the point about how important this is, why the conduct of competition policy can have a very significant impact on the achievement of our national development goals. And if that sets out the problem, if the Competition Commission's landmark study gives us the metrics of the problem, the recent reforms to competition legislation provides us with some of the solution. When it was introduced in Parliament, those reforms were described as a new deal for economic transformation and inclusion. And you'll see as a golden thread through all the changes that were made, with the exception of the institutional changes, the issue of increased participation and inclusion runs through. Those reforms affect a number of changes to law that will focus on inclusion, the promotion of small and medium enterprises, the opening of the economy to new entrants, the promotion of investment to address, and the need to address unusually high levels of economic concentration. The provisions on, among many others, price discrimination, predatory pricing, monopsony, are significant, and the test cases that will enable these innovations, these legislative innovations, to reshape our market is eagerly awaited by many small businesses. The reforms provide for the remit of market inquiries to include issues of industry structure, including the level and trends of concentration and ownership in a sector. This is quite an important element of the reforms, that it shifts the focus from solely looking at conduct to the way in which the very structure of a sector, its ownership patterns, restrict or inhibit the achievement of broader economic and competition goals. And that's the sea change that the competition reforms passed by Parliament introduces. And it provides the competition authorities with enhanced powers to address the harmful effects of economic concentration. Already, even before the reforms were formally introduced, when they were already going through the legislative process, the competition authorities began to put a lens on practices in a number of markets. Examples include the data market inquiries, impact on lowering data costs and providing zero-rated access to educational and government services at a critical time when the pandemic forced learners and citizens online. The grocery retail market inquiry resulted in agreements with some large retailers to end the practice of exclusive leases, and thus, we hope, enable small grocers, butchers, and others to access retail space in malls. The inquiry conducted on online services is the first under the new legislation and is also one of the more complex sectors to prize open. Now, of course, we recognize, and this is important to state, that sometimes concentration may be the unavoidable outcome, given the unavoidable outcome of other factors, given a combination of scale economics in production and the size of the domestic market. However, even in these instances, it's incumbent upon firms in these markets not to exploit customers or exclude rivals, and particular attention should be paid to ensure that black South Africans are not excluded. While I've spoken of competition policy, the policy landscape globally within which competition, trade and investment law plays itself out and which shapes new thinking and approaches in related disciplines has changed significantly over the past few years. In trade policy, the economist Danny Roderick has characterized the shift as one being from efficiency and growth to economic resilience, caused among others by the disruption of supply chains and the shortages of basic goods within national economies. Competition and trade have complex relationships. Many of you will know that there was this effort between 1997 and 2003 at the World Trade Organization to have a working group set up to look at a general agreement on competition policy in the WTO. It pointed to a number of issues of competition law enforcement and competition policy with significance for the global economy. It included, for example, the international dimension of competition law cases and the potential spillovers for economic welfare and the potential for conflicts of jurisdiction, the broadening application of competition policy in relation to intellectual property rights in the global economy, important issues concerning the potential for monopolization and the maintenance of competition in digital markets. This is many years back. Issues concerning state-owned enterprises, the role of industrial policy, and the question of competitive neutrality in economies, and the request on the part of global business to ensure non-discrimination, transparency, and procedural clarity in competition law enforcement worldwide. Not surprisingly, perhaps, given the different national objectives and the desire by country to retain policy space, no consensus was reached at the WTO on a general agreement on competition. But the work does point to the significant interface between domestic competition policy and matters connected to international trade. In June this year, the World Trade Organization held its much-postponed ministerial conference and concluded with a set of agreement that may be of some interest to competition practitioners, covering relaxation of some of the rules on intellectual property in order to facilitate production of vaccines in developing countries. This initiative was led by South Africa and India. Now, intellectual property rights, of course, confer a time-bound monopoly on the use of specified products to a person or a legal entity. And these rights are protected in the World Trade Organization through a trade-related intellectual property rights treaty called TRIPS. During the pandemic, it became clear that the supply and price of therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines were constrained with supply challenges, but also the ability of producers to use product under patent. Where patent holders refused that even where production capacity existed, that their patents be used without their authority, and they then declined to offer such authority. The free pass that e-commerce companies had from customs duties on digital goods was a sticky topic, and ultimately it was agreed to grant a time-bound extension of the moratorium to early 2023. The food price crisis was dealt with by the WTO through an agreement to discourage use of export restrictions on food and the prohibition of subsidies on illegal fishing, including by large foreign fishing fleets in national territorial waters. In South Africa, the rising food prices were the basis of work by both the competition authorities and trade regulators. And I've had to deal with this in a recent decision on poultry anti-dumping duties and an application for tariff increase on frozen vegetables, trying to find that careful balance between pricing challenges and considerations and producer challenges and considerations. So policymakers are taking trade, industrial, and competition policy, what needs to be changed, what needs to be retained. It's part of a wider rethink of economics. Above all, countries across the world recognized that the international division of production and labor, although accompanied by significant benefits in normal times, created substantial vulnerabilities and came with enormous costs in times of crisis. And that's led to this deeper rethinking of the role of these various instruments of policy: industrial policy, competition policy, trade policy. In May last year, we published a statement setting out more explicitly what our competition policy from a government point of view is, and we titled it Competition Policy for Jobs and Industrial Development. We remain over-dependent on offshore sourcing for our own economy and on a few products, mainly commodities, to drive our growth, leaving us as price takers and with our economic performance over-dependent on what happens in global commodity markets. This means that we risk losing out on the greater opportunity that this new wave of diversification and regionalization can bring. South Africa can play a more prominent role in this world of regionalized production hubs, and we can do so with other African countries, building cross-border regional value chains and tapping the opportunities in the African markets. But we can only do so if we step up our focus on improving the dynamism and capacity of our industrial base and create opportunities for firms in our market to grow. And we've codified it into three key things that we will focus on in the year ahead: intensifying industrialization, spearheading transformation, and building a capable state to execute our strategy. The competition authorities have been dealing with ownership issues in mergers more systematically than before. Two key trends relate, on the one hand, to funding mechanisms for BEE commitments, whereas previously, as long as a headline announcement was made, it was incorporated in a competition condition and left there, often resulting in poorly structured empowerment deals. But the competition authorities have now started to really look at the structure and financing of those deals. And secondly, the expansion of worker ownership in enterprises. This new focus on inclusive growth saw about 100,000 additional workers securing shares in the firms that they work for in the past year through, in many cases, competition-related settlements with companies. Burger King, Imperial Logistics, ShopRite, and others, bringing the recorded worker shareholding in the economy to over 400,000 workers. In some cases, with provisions that workers would elect persons or nominate persons to serve on the boards of those companies. One of the innovations in the competition reform has been the provision for exemptions for a class of firms from certain provisions of the Competition Act, the so-called Section 1010 provision. Its value was shown during the pandemic and indeed in the July unrest last year, and it's been used on a number of occasions. Today, we are publishing a draft notice in the Government Gazette setting out proposed terms for a new block exemption for small and medium enterprises to be exempted from certain categories of agreement or practices in the application of Section 4.1 and 5.1 of the Act, in order to enable collaboration between small and medium enterprises that would otherwise contravene the Act. The agreements cover a range of areas: research and development agreements, production agreements for goods or the provision of services or toll manufacturing by one firm for another, joint purchasing agreements which may include collective purchasing by a subset of firms, joint selling prices of goods or services to and through an intermediary, commercialization agreement which can include cooperation between firms relating to selling, distribution or promotion of their products, standardization agreements on technical or quality issues, and collective negotiation with large buyers or suppliers on the terms and conditions for purchasing or supply of goods and services. There's a 30-day period for public comments, and I hope that participants at this conference will provide comments during the course of tomorrow's conference proceedings. A number of companies have in the past made the case for a facility where the Commission can provide non-binding advisory opinions on request. This was taken up in the amendments to the legislation, And a draft notice has been issued previously for public comment. Some representations have been made. The authorities have taken it into account, and during September, we intend to publish a final notice providing for the issuing of non-binding advisory opinions so that market participants may have the benefit of current thinking and interpretation available to guide their decisions. By their nature, the competition authorities have to apply and enforce the law. It requires rules, it requires paperwork, and as part of the commitment to smart regulation and removing unnecessary red tape or ambiguity, by October this year, we will publish a number of revised forms, notices, and rules of the Competition Commission. It's our hope this would contribute to reducing red tape and improving the working of the authorities. The 2019 amendments aim to strengthen enforcement by removing the so-called yellow card warning for all contraventions of Chapter 2 of the Act. Once greater certainty on the enforcement approach was provided through regulation. The Ministry aimed to complete this process by November by issuing draft regulations for public comments for horizontal agreements under Section 4.1a and vertical agreements under Section 5.1. The purpose of the regulations is to provide greater clarity on the types of agreements that may fall within these sections, as well as the parameters, the factors, the benchmarks to be considered when undertaking the rule of reason assessment. The regulations, we hope, will provide a framework for how potential efficiencies are weighed against any harm and may provide safe harbors where there is a presumption of unlikely harm to the extent appropriate. The regulation is intended to provide certainty for business to proceed with agreements that promote growth and efficiency while strongly deterring those agreements that seek to harm competition through, among others, administrative penalties. They'll also ensure that enforcement furthers the objective of promoting more inclusive growth through the participation of SMMEs and historically disadvantaged persons in the economy. Our experience over the last 12 months of participation in mergers and acquisitions the last 12 years. Our experience over the last 12 years of participation in mergers and acquisitions have yielded considerable learnings. Our obligation to look not only at the narrow competition grounds for whether a merger can or cannot be justified, but to look also at the public interest and to balance these two is central to South Africa's competition regime. The Act explicitly compels us to look at how a merger impacts on employment, on small and medium businesses, on black business, on regions and industries, our ability to compete in international markets, on the spread of ownership in the market, particularly that of black South Africans and workers. Over the years, we've negotiated with a number of companies in all manner of industries, from food and beverage, national retailers, miners, oil and gas companies, and financial services. And the settlement agreements which have come from these negotiations have created platforms for partnership between the South African government and social partners, protecting and creating jobs and driving investment in resilient, competitive supply chains and in fixed assets. So the market has said, can we get more certainty on what's expected? By February next year, or sooner depending on our work, I will publish regulations in terms of the Competition Act setting out a guide for how the DTIC works with merging parties to craft an appropriate set of public interest commitments. These regulations will serve as helpful models to the market on how both our shared public interest and that of shareholders can be enhanced during a merger. With these regulations, we hope to address many of the questions which merging parties have on how the DTIC participates in mergers and how a meaningful set of commitments can be shaped. In conclusion, complexity and the level of national ambition will give many more areas where competition policy can help the attainment of national goals. The President has spoken powerfully on the value of social compacting, of a broader partnership for growth, investment and jobs. Some of the settlement agreements reached during merger proceedings may be described as social compacts at the micro level. At the same time, some of the efforts to foster greater local industrial development needs to guard against collusive actions that undermine strong and dynamic competition between firms. So it's to just navigate this complex terrain. Our goal with competition policy are ambitious. It's been described as ambitious. It's been sometimes criticized as ambitious. The level of ambition is set by the size of the challenge South Africa faces, by the reality in townships and workplaces, not by the ideas in our heads. In our level of ambition, though, we should always carefully calibrate implementation with capacity and build that capacity. And always recognize that as we reform, it is unavoidable to disturb vested interest. That the test is not whether every single economic interest is happy, but whether the authorities are effective and that we make progress on that journey that President Mandela set out so clearly, and a journey that young people in townships and in rural areas desperately need us to take with greater vigor, greater energy, and greater expeditiousness. It strikes me that the practice of the new competition framework, being pioneered by the South African competition authorities, the Commission, the Tribunal, and the Competition Appeal Court, has at times moved faster than the conceptual and intellectual work that normally accompanies a paradigm shift. There is a real need for a competition institute that would galvanize more PhD work on the South African model of competition policy, secure greater case studies that show us from whether it is predation to excessive pricing to a merger settlement agreement, what the impact is on the public interest. Deepen the teaching of the new competition framework to officials within government departments, to other regulators, to officials in the competition authorities, to practitioners in the law firms in Sandton and elsewhere. And that's something that I think would be an endeavor that we should take forward collectively. I hope you can come tonight. I hope you've all been invited for the dinner. I should check that first from those who are paying the bills. Because I think at this changing of guard moment, it would be appropriate to thank those who have led the work and to welcome those who are going to be leading the work. Thank you very much.
Nkosi Mhlekazi obekekileyo umphathiswa wezoqoqosho nezokhuphiswano nezoshishino jikelele obekekileyo Ebrahim Patel. Thank you so much, sir, for your words. I mean, you said a lot, but I will say this. All I heard was Burger King, Imperial Logistics, and ShopRite. I feature there. Thank you, Minister, for the recognition. Represented here today in the continuation of salutations are, of course, South Africa, Kenya, Mambo Peter, habari. Very good. China, India, Angola, Brazil, Greece, Egypt, the United Kingdom, Zambia, Switzerland, the DRC, Nelly Sakata, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, of course, our friends from the United States and Russia. At a multilateral platform, the African Union, COMESA, Common Markets of East and Southern Africa, UNCTAD, of course, BRICS, of course, the ACF, and the resurrection of one venerated boxer, but now he's a director at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I kid you not, Muhammad Ali. We have, of course, in keeping with this very fluid program, by the way, the program is no more than a guideline. The authority is here. Because what is happening on the program is not what in reality is turning out to be. Mr. Dave Lewis, please come forward. You know, Americans talk fondly of their founding fathers. We're talking about people who were party to the drafting of the Constitution in the late 18th century. They still talk about them today. Okay, so we'll do the same thing. We have the opportunity to have Mr. Dave Lewis among our rank today, founding father, if you will, of the competition authorities as we now know them to be. It is great to have him among our rank, and a round of applause and a standing ovation is most due. Mr. Bonagele.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. We've decided last minute, and I'm really grateful to Nandi to present a token to Dave. Dave, as I said, we're grateful that you could be here. I mean, it's true that if there was a Lifetime Achiever Award for this, you would be a worthy recipient. But we don't have that. Forgive us. But Nandi has been very creative in doing a little token on our behalf, and we'll have the minister presenting it. It's the quotes from Dave's judgments, which have been framed, and Nandi will read them.
Okay, you all know the commissioner. Thankfully, he's commissioner for one more day. He likes to ambush people, so I've been ambushed, and I'm here to deliver this tribute to Dave Lewis. We could not think of a better gift, Dave, than to remember you by your own words, because it's your words that have influenced us and the way we think in no small way. You know, judgments like the nationwide polls judgment, the ANZAC one, and speeches that you've written over the years have really shaped the way that we think as a competition agency, and we're very grateful for the way you pioneered that road for us. So there's 4 framed quotes in the package that you'll get, but I'm just going to read from one of your speeches from 2002, which I think every practitioner probably has read by now. But it's one of those, it's a classic from you, and it stands out. And I think to all the young competition practitioners, this will just give you a sense of the kind of wit that Dave always puts in his judgments and his speeches, and the way in which he brings competition law home and makes us feel like we all understand what is going on finally, and it applies to all of us. So let me just read this one quote. And please remember, this was in 2002, so this was at a time when public interest was not common in competition regimes around the world. And we were really, in South Africa, seen as an anomaly. And so this was one of the ways Dave Lewis defended us, which he had to do on public platforms, international platforms, quite a lot. He wrote, "I've come to treat our task in dealing with public interest in much the same way that I treat my mad uncle, in much the same way that every family treats its mad uncle, with wary respect. We may try to ignore him, we may even deny his existence, but he somehow manages to turn up, invited or not, at every major family event. For the most part, he turns out to be quite an amiable, agreeable old chap, but he does have the potential to behave in a very unpredictable manner, one that causes severe embarrassment to a smug, complacent family, often threatening to tear it apart and reduce its reputation and standing in the society at large." So, Dave, thank you very much for everything that you've done.
you've said. Here it is.
Thank you very much. I mean, this really was not the intention in coming here at all. It really is a pleasure to be back in this environment. Because I'm a man and not a woman, I can only do one thing at a time, and so I have not been as kept as current with competition law and practice as I would like to have been. I've seen Eleanor consistently, and others with whom I've worked and practiced, and truly it is the most exciting and intellectually stimulating branch of law, and I think economics. So you're really lucky to have it. I mean, I think, I'm here today as living proof of how old the competition authorities are. Eleanor was at the beginning of competition law. I don't know if you know, she was a personal friend of President Teddy Roosevelt and kind of invented competition law. And I was one of her outputs, if you like. It was truly, I've had the good fortune to do a lot of interesting things, including, I'm sure in this room, the person who has worked with Ibrahim for the longest possible time. My children many years ago used to call him God, because he was the only one who could call at 11 o'clock at night while he was a union leader, and after I'd left the unions. And there were negotiations of one thing or another at NEDLAC, and ask for a data or a speech to be prepared by sort of 8 o'clock the next morning, and I would actually do it. I don't know to this day why I did, but that's why he got called God. Anyway, and he must now be one of the longest serving members of cabinet, not quite as long as Minister Sisulu, but then he doesn't have quite as elevated a surname, and it has been. We haven't always agreed with each other, but it's always been a very stimulating relationship. There's no doubt about that. So thank you very much for this. It's a really a lovely present to receive, and I indeed will put it up on the wall now that I've started actually working and thinking again after a period of not doing so. And so you'll hear from me. Thank you.
If you'll all remain standing as Mr. Lewis leaves the podium, just as much we know that the minister has to attend to his other obligations, not least because it is a Wednesday, cabinet meetings. So Minister Patel, thank you so much for your time. Dave Lewis, Godspeed. We wish you well, not least your health. And for all of those in attendance, please, we will take, I'm not going to call it a tea break because it often makes it a lunch break. Let's take a comfort break, no more than 10 minutes. Dr. Vilakazi, you and I should meet very briefly, please, because we need to start in 10 minutes from now, with or without your panelists. Those who are in the overflow room, please come and make your way into the main auditorium. There are a couple of seats that are available. We don't want you to think you're the forgotten stepchild. It is the comfort break. Please, everybody, 10 minutes. 11:07 now. 11:17 we resume. Welcome back to the first official plenary, Competition, Regulation and Policy Development for Sustainable, Growing and Inclusive Markets. Dr. Vilakazi, Chris Malikane, Simon Roberts, Harun Borat, Khanki Matabane. If we don't start now, I suspect this will play as a metaphor for the day. And of course, because we have a dinner that is set to start at a specific time and end at a specific time, and this being day 1 of 2, we need to start, please. So could I request that we settle down inside? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Who removed it? The bonus thing, I just like. But I think you need to coordinate that with the time because I'm not going to participate. Tando, does everyone have a mic? If we could have the doors closed, please. If we could shut the doors, please. South Africa is currently facing constrained economic growth, weak economic transformation, challenges of inequality, unemployment, low investment levels, and over-regulation have been identified as some of the key contributing factors to South Africa's dire situation right now. There's need for an analytical, comprehensive, in-depth discussion on how government, business, and labor can indeed work together to alter the country's trajectory to an economy that grows and does so sustainably. The panelists will set out the key economic questions and debate the decisions required from government, firms, and labor, and the role of competition authorities in creating this ideal South Africa. Moderator, member of the tribunal, Dr. Thando Vilakazi, Professor Chris Malikane, Wits University, Simon Roberts, Professor, University of Johannesburg. From the UCT, Harun Borat, I understand he is on his way, Zwelinzima Vavi, SG of SAFTU. Thando, you have 3 of your 4 panelists. If Vavi should join, I will just usher him onto the platform, but please start. You have 1 hour and 10 minutes, and that includes question and answer. My time is 11:22. I'll be back here at 12:32. Thank you. No, sorry. 12:32, I'll be back.
Right. Thanks. Well noted, MC. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Thando Vilakazi. I am the director of the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg, with a side gig at the Competition Tribunal. This panel, however, has got a lot less to do with competition law proper, but actually using this platform and the kind of caliber of candidates that we have on the panel to talk about some of the big picture issues. We, as the Minister has set out, live in a very complex, challenged society in terms of the kind of overlapping, reinforcing challenges of poverty, inequality, but also access to opportunity and participation that play out on a daily basis. I think the Minister puts it starkly when he says the issue is about what happens in our townships, in our workplaces, and how do you change the plight of those that seek to be at least participants in this economy. We also work in a space where our law has, perhaps quite uniquely in the global context, introduced this idea of participation. This idea that the law, competition law, is not necessarily just a playground for really smart lawyers and economists, but actually that what matters is the substance. What matters is what we deliver. What matters is whether we can reduce barriers to entry and open up access to this economy so that all can participate. And I think this is an exciting place to start. Even as we evolve through the program, starting to get into the nitty-gritty of our work, it's important here to have this caliber of academics, of practitioners that think about these issues on a daily basis. And I think allowing us to zoom out slightly from the work that we do in the competition authorities. Thankfully, the MC has introduced my panel, but just to reintroduce Professor Harun Borat, Professor Chris Malikane, Wits University, and then Professor Simon Roberts at UJ and at UCL. I'm told that we're expecting a colleague also, some of you might know him from the labor movement, and might also be expecting a colleague from the Black Business Council, Ukhanki Matabane, to join the panel. But in any event, given the time constraints, we'll just get straight to it. So the task of our panel is to think through the broader competition policy issues, policy development as it relates to sustainability, inclusion more broadly, and development in our society. Now this is, as you see, very much part of the central kind of focus of the competition authorities. And so I suppose in many ways what we say here might be able to shape mandates going forward. Harun, I want to open and maybe bring you in first here. I mean, you've prolific author that spends so much of the time thinking around issues of broader labor markets in South Africa, of economic participation, but also even recently in 2017, some of the challenges wrought by, I think in a piece of work you call with colleagues, the betrayal of the promise, some of the challenges of state capture, and this task of now having to rebuild institutions for effective inclusion. I wanted to draw you in here maybe to set the scene for us in terms of certainly what do the trends look like coming out of this kind of COVID environment, but I suppose also reflecting a bit on the role of institutions, rebuilding institutions and the pathway forward for an economy like ours. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Thando. I can confirm that post-COVID, one of the things I least like is getting up at 4 a.m. for a 6 a.m. flight from Cape Town to Johannesburg. I thought when I was invited to the panel, I could lead with the fact to avoid the flight that I wasn't a competition practitioner, even though some of my best friends are. That didn't seem to dissuade the panel. So I'm going to march on anyway and talk about everything except competition policy, because that's not really my area of research. But I'm hoping, actually, listening to some of the deliberations this morning, that it may, using your own lens of thinking about firms and firm behavior, lend yourself to thinking a little bit more expansively about what I'm going to call the supply side of the economy. And I want to sort of take us towards two ultimate points. One is that would argue that we've thought about the unemployment challenge in a very, very superficial way. And in fact, want to introduce, as I've done repeatedly, the paper is still coming, a very important notion about how we've missed our analytical insight. We've missed a key analytical insight in thinking about unemployment. And the second proposition is that policy, as a consequence of that lens, in South Africa has focused far too much on households and far too little on firms. And on the firm side, that would include the kind of work that goes on within the Commission. So let me start with the unemployment story. So, you've heard the statistics. You'll glaze over them. You see them repeatedly. That South Africa has one of the, and in fact, by the latest WDI, World Development Indicators, has the highest unemployment rate in the world. So that includes countries that you would consider post-war, fragile economies, and so on. So I looked up the numbers yesterday. 34% is our sort of acceptable post-COVID unemployment rate. The closest is Djibouti at 25%, followed by Eswatini, also at about 24%. So you've heard those numbers before, right? And that's where we stop. The new piece of evidence to, not the new piece of evidence, but the evidence to associate with the highest unemployment rate in the world is that South Africa has one of the lowest rates of informality. And that's a really, really important coupling of the two statistics. So if you look at a distribution of rates of informality, and don't get too hung up on definitions, they generally coalesce around non-registered businesses, survivalist enterprises, unpaid family work, and so on. If you look at a distribution across a sample of countries, mainly in the middle-income country space, low-income countries tend to be agriculture dominant, we're right at the left of a bar graph. We have informality rates of about 25% as a share of the labor force. The Latin American average, the average is 45%. In other middle-income countries in Latin America, it's north of 70%. So here's the point, right? That and let me add one piece of sort of just to support the argument of where I'm going is that if you look at output employment elasticity, so if you look at, so that I know there's some lawyers in the room, so the output employment elasticity is the relationship between growth and employment. The output employment elasticity for South Africa is about 0.7. Guess what? The rest of the developing world's output employment elasticity is about the same. So it's not like the rest of the developing world's really good at keeping their unemployment rates low through a growth employment conversion. No. What do? They resolve it by allowing the informal sector to expand and operate willy-nilly, right? There are massive informal sectors that mop up what would be the unemployed in developing countries. So that's why, I mean, just as a quick sort of dotted line link to this conversation, Ricardo Hausmann, who led the Harvard delegation 10 years back and is now back again, looked at us and he said, but I don't understand this unemployment rate. It doesn't make any sense. It's only though when, in a recent conversation, the last 6 months, I said to him, but look at the rate of informality and compare it to Latin America. Suddenly the penny drops. Because the output employment elasticities are similar. The challenges with regards to growth, the structural patterns of growth that we have, we're not unusual, right? So what are these other countries doing? Well, and this is the point I want to come to in terms of policy, is they allow the informal sector to operate. They don't have an anti-informal sector bias, or they better not, right? So let me just give you one vivid example. You all know about the rickshawalas in India, right? These guys that drive, right? Try and formalize them. You try and formalize those guys, or you try and charge them license fees to operate their rickshaws. There'll be a revolution on the street, right? The informal sector in every single developing country or middle-income country, let's narrow the sample, is allowed to operate unfettered, is allowed to find a space of economic activity, a literal physical space of economic activity to operate. What does that do? It dampens unemployment rates. Some of the conditional estimates we're still working on would suggest that if we had unemployment rates, informality rates similar to other developing countries, our open unemployment rate, our narrow unemployment rate would be between 8 and 15% lower. Think about that. So the big dial pusher on unemployment, right, and reducing unemployment, it's got not very little, but it's got far less to do with the patterns and the structure of growth, I would argue, than the size of the informal sector. So then you ask your question, so what's going on? Well, and as we've said in the President's Economic Advisory Council, and it came through the SONA, is the first thing is do no harm. Right? The first thing as a policy focus, what you could do is just allow the informal sector to operate. Don't see it your job to remove the informal sector, to beat people out of the cities and so on. Allow the cities to look like every single other developing country city. And so here's another sort of, for your evening supper after the second glass of wine, what's the visual image you want to take home? Is why does South Africa always look like a European city? Because there's no informal sector, right? The distance, as I tell students, between firm and household, so I'm coming back, firm and household, in an average developing country, the distance between you being a household and a firm is 1 meter. Because people sleep, right, in their home, in the cities, they open the doors and they start selling. And so that's not something you see in South Africa. And again, we don't have enough time to talk about why we've seen that. A lot of it's got to do with spatial apartheid and so on. But it's then taken me to a space, and I was trying to explain it without a visual, and I do have a visual which I can share, of what is it that government then needs to do in terms of thinking about growing. And this is a very unusual policy prescription, right? Because now we're talking about growing the informal sector. So most developing countries are thinking about formalizing the informal sector, right? Let's get them registered. Let's get them paying taxes. No. You've got to allow the informal sector, just as a first order of business, to allow them to operate unfettered. What that is definitely going to do is reduce your unemployment rate. But we're not set up in all sorts of ways to allow the informal sector to operate unhindered, as it were. And so the argument I make is we've thought, if you think of the unemployment challenge, we think of it, and that was the second point, that we think of it as a household-focused policy support program rather than firms. And I want to argue, and as we've argued repeatedly in the Advisory Council, that we need to switch the focus. We need to think of the informal sector. If you think of the unemployed, think of how can I find opportunities through survivalist enterprises for these individuals that are unemployed. That's moving from supporting households to supporting firms. The problem, at least in the discourse that we often have as microeconomists, not maybe necessarily in this domain here, is when we think of reducing unemployment, reducing poverty and inequality, we think of the household. We think of grants. We think of the SRD, right? We think of child support grants, maybe a little bit of search costs for the unemployed. We never think of the unemployed as potentially a firm. We never think of the one person trying to sell millies or cigarettes or chips in a city as a firm. And therefore we don't have appropriate policy for them. And so I've argued, as I say, the paper is coming, that we need to switch to what I've called supply-side economics of a good type. And supply-side economics of a good type is, if you can imagine a table, right? With due respect, even the lawyers know what a table is, right? So you've got columns and you've got rows, right? Some of my best friends are lawyers, I promise you. But if you think of columns in the table as firm size must start from the survivalist firm, because that person is selling something. They are a firm. Don't only think of registered entities or those that are tax paying and so on. Survivalist enterprises to 50 plus registered firms in the columns. In the rows is the categories of policy support that's required by government. Policy support or any kind of policy intervention. And you can categorize them. It could be infrastructure, it could be regulation, it could be fiscal incentives, it could be skill support, it could be financial markets. But the kind of support you provide is very different depending on the size and the nature of the firm. I'll give you one quick example. A survivalist enterprise or an informal sector operator in the city of Cape Town would need what? Storage facilities. It's as simple as that. They need ablution facilities. Not to be kicked out, that's supply side intervention. This is not expensive, right? But this is a supply side intervention. They don't need the ports fixed. That's for large firms. That's on the far end of the size spectrum. That's a different kind of infrastructure. And if you look at our policy discourse, we talk a lot about ports. We don't talk about storage facilities. We don't talk about ablution facilities for micro enterprises or survivalists. That's what's going to move the dial, I promise you. Not better ports are not unimportant, but it's about the change in emphasis if you want to think about unemployment. Just very, very quickly. So what are the sort of big ideas one can think of? Here's one example of how we get it wrong, right? We have a supply side intervention for survivalist enterprises, right? So we don't think of it so what is it called? It's called a hawker's license. You've heard of that, right? So if you're going to go and sell oranges outside Athlone Police Station where I grew up, there's a guy I still buy oranges from, right? He's got to go and register his business and he's got to pay a fee. He's paying a fee. How on earth why is he paying 1,200 Rand a year, right? That's a disincentive to operate. That's a cost of doing business, right? And so you think of all these constraints that the informal sector face, right? Those are the things to attack. Zero rate hawkers licenses immediately. Yet what do? We debate endlessly. I promise I'm not going to get into the debate about the SRD. Even though the council advised in the SRD, I think it's a bad idea to make it permanent. I have one council member here who's smiling and agrees with me. But we'll think of an SRD debate, right? But we won't think of zero rating hawkers licenses, which is a supply side intervention that gets at firms, right? And is potentially permanent, right? Potentially has a longer run consequence in terms of allowing economic activity. Now, I've given you easy things, right? One of the hardest things to do, and then maybe I'll stop there, Chair. One of the hardest things to do, and that's where I haven't resolved in my mind how one can fix it easily, is the spatial dimension. So South Africa is probably the only country where the poor, right, live furthest away from where consumers are. Right? In most other countries, the poor are right where the consumers are. They're living in cities, right, where consumers with high disposable income. And so the spatial dimension is probably one of the key things to fix if you're trying to expand the informal sector. So very quickly, summarize. You want to move the dial on unemployment, think about the informal sector. And how do we know this? Because we have one of the lowest rates of informality in the developing world, right? Given that, if you look at our supply side policies, they're all focused towards the registered large end of the firm size spectrum. There's very little going on in terms of micro enterprises and the informal sector. And I think the more we think about that, I think we give more oxygen to a debate about sustainably reducing our unemployment levels.
Thanks, Haroon. So I think the kind of golden thread there, and I hope we can double back to some of the issues that you raise, is the idea of openness and an idea of innovation. Rethinking the way that we've perhaps thought about economic systems, and certainly in the South African context, rethinking the way in which we think about inclusion, right? And I think most of us are familiar with this in the context of analyzing barriers to entry, analyzing and dealing with the plight of HDP or SMME-owned firms in mergers and cases. But of course, we know that the problem runs far deeper than even the work that we do. So I think it's really important to open up the conversation to this broader set of issues. In keeping with that theme, I want to bring Prof. Malikane in here to bring the other side of the coin, if you will, the kind of the economic enemy being the macroeconomist, as it were. But also importantly, to give us a bit of context and set the scene as we talk about inclusion, as we talk about markets, the kind of broader picture, the state of this economy in terms of investment, the kind of shift out of COVID, and maybe some thoughts on trajectories forward.
Thank you, Doc, and good morning, colleagues. Professor Simon Roberts, Professor Borat, and my fellow panelists. Good morning. Perhaps the starting point is to state the obvious, that the South African economy is operating on a low growth path. That's the starting point. If you look at the trajectory of the South African economy from 2004 to see it clearly to 2022, you see that in 2007 there was this large demand shock that we experienced globally, and it affected the South African economy to a point where we never recovered. When you look at the trajectory subsequent to that shock, you see that we were growing on a certain path, then the shock occurs, and then we veer off. We just flew away from the original path. And when you look at, for example, economies such as the US, you see that immediately after the shock, they put in place policies that at least kept the economy growing parallel to the original path. But in our case, we simply flew away. We are still flying away, by the way, from the path. And the flying is flat now. We are going that direction when the original path was in this direction. This is what has happened before COVID. So, to a point that what worries me now, Doc, is that we seem to have forgotten about that shock. We are now focusing on COVID. But that shock, the failure to respond to that shock, is the biggest loss that South Africa incurred. So that's the starting point. That large aggregate demand shock, it's a demand shock, not a supply shock. And then in between, then we experienced short-run supply shocks, electricity shocks, prices, oil price shocks, etc. But that shock set us on a path that is opposite or perpendicular to what we were supposed to go to. Now, currently, as we have noticed, is that there is a war between Russia and the Ukraine. And the impact of that has been to increase the price of oil and other energy products. And that feeds into the increase in the price of food. It creates an inflationary environment. So that is, to me, the biggest supply shock that we've experienced since that huge demand shock. And these shocks that I'm talking about are persistent. They are persistent. And there is a tendency for policymakers in South Africa to sit on their hands, in my view, and not immediately take actions to try and steer the economy in a vigorous way or keep the economy on a growth path. Right? They sit on their hands, the shock works itself out, and then it gathers momentum and other shocks build on this shock, and then it becomes too difficult to go back to the original path. Now, with the Russia-Ukraine shock, supply shock, what we have is now an inflationary environment in the context where there's massive underutilization of capacity in the economy. So there's a demand shock on the one side, there's massive underutilization of capacity, persistent, right? And on top of that, we've got a negative supply shock, which increases inflation. And in that context, then from the competition point of view, I think that environment provides nice cover for firms to do excessive pricing because it's a general inflationary environment. So perhaps that is one thing that the authorities have to look at. Now, in terms of the prospects for growth, right, in that environment, I do not see any prospects of South Africa coming back or even creating a parallel path to that original growth path. If you look at consumption expenditure, it's driven largely by incomes, right? Majority of the people do not have access to credit. So they rely on incomes. As Professor Borat was saying, some of the income is from the informal sector. But if you've got rising unemployment brought about by this negative demand shock, on the one hand, and then you've got suppressed wages on the other, all of those factors then work to weaken consumption as an outlet to boost demand. Interest rates, right? Those that have got access to credit, the Reserve Bank responds by raising interest rates, saying that they are controlling inflation. That suppresses consumption as well. So I don't see any prospects of growth or demand stimulus coming through private consumption. Already, those that have got debt are heavily indebted, right? And they are facing prospects of being unemployed because there's this persistent aggregate demand problem that is not being resolved. The president, moving to investment now, the investment component of aggregate demand. The president has been holding investment conferences. But some of us who know the basic drivers of investment, we know it's capacity utilization. You can't invest in your firm if you're already underutilizing capacity. What for? The second factor that drives investment is profitability. So if you look at the trend in the rate of profit, South African economy, it has been declining for quite a while. And this rate of profit, average rate of profit, is met with rising interest rates, which means that that gap between the industrial rate of profit and the interest rate is narrowing, which blunts the incentive to invest. So the key fundamental factors that drive investment are weak. We can have conferences, investment conferences, what they call this, motivational speeches, building confidence. That's what, there's this thing that we need to build confidence. But you can't build confidence when there's a structural underutilization of capacity, there's low profitability in the system, interest rates are rising. So you can have all these investment conferences, nothing is going to come out of them because the structural factors that drive investment are not correct. You will try to seek growth by looking at exports, right? So we've got a problem with Transnet, just basic stuff, Transnet. We've got problems with Eskom, supply of electricity. You can't even supply your export markets. That on its own disrupts your market share, right? And the global economy is not growing as fast to absorb your exports. So there's no growth prospects even with that outlet. Of course, imports negatively affect our aggregate demand. I won't go there. So exports out, consumption not sustainable. Because if you increase credit to households now, in the context of low growth and rising unemployment, it's not sustainable, right? Investment out, because there's excessive capacity underutilization and a no profitability incentive to invest. So if you look at COVID now, coming to COVID, I looked at the manufacturing capacity utilization, the measure from the South African Reserve Bank. Manufacturing capacity utilization before the global crisis was 85%, right? It dropped to 80% and stayed there, which means that that gap, that 5% gap, is that permanent underutilization of capacity over and above that underutilization that was there before, right? COVID hits, right? There's a dip in capacity utilization, but then it recovers to 77%, not to 80%. So the COVID shock further pushes us away. And why is it that the economy is not responding? The first thing is government's response is weak. Government's response is weak. Government has been administering what is called fiscal consolidation over years, which in my view is just austerity. When other countries intervened in their economies to fund massive infrastructure build programs in unconventional ways, fund social infrastructure programs in unconventional ways. But in our case, government could not intervene because of limited what is called limited fiscal space, when other countries created that fiscal space through their central banks. And another factor is the neoliberalism. The minister was talking about the need to fundamentally rethink economic policy. It's not happening. In South Africa, we are the largest adherents of neoliberalism. Even those that we followed in the early 90s adopted unconventional ways. New Zealand, for example, changed the mandate of their central bank to include full employment. We are stuck with inflation targeting. You see. So government is hung up on conservative neoliberal economic policies. And in terms of roles, just to conclude, right? There's this thinking that came that government, it's not government's business to create jobs. It's the business of the private sector. But as economists, we know that the private sector's aim is to maximize profits. And if in that process it leads to job creation, so be it. So if government abdicates the responsibility to create jobs to the private sector, then I think that we are in trouble because the private sector will not create jobs if there's no demand.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And then lastly, if you want labor, right, to play its role in the so-called social compact, the main thing that labor can offer is wage moderation. But wage moderation cannot come if the wage goods, the prices of wage goods are not in check so that the real wage is protected. So one of the things that the Competition Commission must look at is the inflation rate in wage goods in this context. I saw some statistics showing that cooking oil has increased by 70%. So if you look at those components of the wage goods that particularly affect the poor, it will go a long way in mitigating the impact. Sure. And infrastructure, of course, the value chain. There needs to be a focused attention on infrastructure value chain by competition authorities so that government intervention, whatever it does, it's effective.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, so I think you put a lot on the table there. Content which I think is important even in the context of discussing what is otherwise essentially a microeconomic tool. But the translation there is really that also prices, markets, this environment in terms of inflationary pressures can come from cost-related factors on the supply side, etc. But also firms set prices. Firms charge excessive prices. Cartels of firms are prone to charging super competitive profits, right? And I think this is an important link between the macro environment where we're in, where we know that prices tend to be sticky downwards, but are very quick to rise. And part of resetting the economy, I think, is finding that balance, again, that Prof is talking about. I want to take this opportunity, in fact, to bring in the General Secretary of SAFTU, who's joined us, Comrade Vavi, who, in fact, I think most recently has been thinking and working on these issues, not least in the national shutdown of 2 weeks ago, led by the trade union movements in the country. And I've had a chance to look quite closely at the declarations as they related to the issues that were being raised. And I think they link quite nicely with Prof's points earlier that we're in a very challenging environment. And I think at the level of households, it's even more intense in terms of rising cost pressures, etc. Mr. Vavi, if I can bring you in here, maybe to give us a sense of the kind of core messages that were being conveyed in that environment and in the declaration, and the pathways and challenges, I suppose, that you see. Sure. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and I wanted to see you first before I can proceed. And I guess that my coming here has more to do not just with the institution that have played such a critical role, in particular in the recent years, but more so the tenacity of you, Comrade Bonagel, who have been steering the ship for the past 18 years, firstly as a deputy and now in charge of the tribunal. And we can only be very, very thankful and applaud your work as part of this very critical institution that today we are speaking about. And thank you very much. Thank you. I guess that somewhere down the line, the labor movement must find time to honor you and to thank you and the people we have been working with behind the scenes to bring some of the rogue elements in the private sector to book, to embarrass them. I'm sure they don't like you for that. And but at times to punish them and to find them. How I wish that you could have more power though, so that when we gather here, we're speaking about few CEOs in prison. In particular from the banking cartels, who have been doing everything that they can to undermine the transformation agenda you have been championing. And the struggle to give you that power to jail people continues, even if you are operating elsewhere in society. And it's a very critical struggle that I guess all of us have to pursue. The right to send people who are milking the poor dry to prison for committing serious treason against them. And we've been big admirers of the work of the Competition Commission. From the time you started to really be on their tails, when the country was celebrating and the biggest sporting event ever in South Africa, you exposed them. You exposed the cement cartels, who, instead of joining the country in celebrating this biggest soccer event in the world, they were angling to look at how they will profit unfairly and increase the prices of cement and take advantage of the vulnerability of a society that was so eager to have a world standard beating World Cup in 2010. Around the same period, you were chasing the milk cartels, the milk producing companies. Can you believe it? They're after the bread. Everything basic that you will think that should be the fundamental right of human being, private companies in South Africa have been angling to take advantage of ordinary people. And latest now, massive guys, big fellows who control us literally in every respect of our lives in the insurance industry. Again, the Competition Commission have been there to chase them. And I think that for that, in my view, you personally, but also the team that you have been working with, deserve a round of applause, even if I'm going to be alone doing so. Adinamona. Having said that, it's been like climbing an oiled pole though. We are living in a country which we inherited monopolies and which inherited an economic structure that was designed to make South Africa some post for colonial activity of extracting the minerals, sending them raw out to certain colonizing countries, and increasingly now our friends who are our foes, at the same time China. And we're living in a country that was arranged such that everything that is arranged through that main activity, which was mining and extraction, is developed and in the process becomes a monopoly. Competition is a nice word said in the context of the economic arrangement in South Africa. Seems like we can sit in these nice hotels and speak about 4IR and forget that where I come from, there's no one IR there. There's no first industrial revolution. There's no road. There's no public road. There's hardly any working water system or sanitation or anything like that. It's so nice to speak about those things when their full context is not properly explained to people. And I think in this particular context, we've got to whilst giving you applaud for the work that you've been doing, but at the same time be realistic about the setting in our economy. That our economy is currently totally dominated by a handful of massive multinational corporations that have made South Africa their home and who are therefore able to bully the state in particular to adopt everything they believe in. And Chris was speaking about how the monopolies have been able to dictate what should be the policy direction of South Africa. And that's why the guys like Bonakele are so unpopular in certain quarters, because they've been disturbing the arrangement, the eating arrangement, the real capture of the state that nobody wants to speak about. And that they have been exposing how cold and they can be when they are in pursuit of profits. So I came here to speak about the critical importance that even in that arrangement, which is not an ideal arrangement at all, you can still play a role, and that society must still continue to champion a competition commission and a tribunal that can still have even greater powers than we have been able to lobby government to give yourselves in the recent period. And I don't know what more I can say except to condemn these guys. Are they here in the house? I honestly don't know.
They might represent themselves as we talk through the Q&A. Thank you for those remarks.
Are they represented? Can they stand up?
Of course.
Thank you very much. I'll come back, I guess. Yeah.
So I think you raised some important issues about the kind of critical role that these institutions have played and the kind of competition authorities, right? Because it is not necessarily an easy environment in which to open up markets, to deal with strategic barriers to entry, and to hopefully open up markets for participation. We know, in fact, as the Commission's very sterling work on concentration, the economy tells us, is that although things have changed, very little has changed as well. And so essentially the challenge of economic concentration, but also broader participation in the process of growth, in a kind of wider conception of inclusive growth, means that we haven't achieved some of the objectives of making this a truly participatory economic system. And on that note, I do want to bring in both Simon and Mr. Matabane, maybe to start with you, Mr. Matabane, on representing the apex umbrella body of black businesses, the Black Business Council. These are issues, I imagine, in engagements with your membership, but also trying to engage with stakeholders in the economy, policymakers, etc., are kind of front and center, right? We're talking about issues of barriers to entry. We're talking more broadly, just to remind colleagues that it was the Black Business Council, I think in the late 90s, that, amongst others, triggered the process that ultimately led to our Black Economic Empowerment Act in 2003, right? And that's 20 years old next year. Have we made progress? What's still on the table to be addressed, and how can you see the fit between the wider program of black economic empowerment, but also dealing with inequalities of participation of different kinds, gender, etc., and how it might match and task the competition authorities to take these issues further.
And good, it's not morning yet anymore. It's a good day. And I think I would like to join Comrade Vavi in congratulating the commissioner, the outgoing commissioner, and his deputy. I can see the deputies there for sterling work that make them unpopular. And we applaud them and we support them. They've done extremely well. I think it's one of the few government institutions that are really functioning well. Yeah, but I think as part of opening the market to other participants, maybe next time when we have a panel, make sure that the panel has women in that. I'm sure 28 years into democracy, we do have capable women, especially black women. So even if I'm not invited anymore, I think it's fine. But I think maybe let's start with where we are. So we're here 28 years into democracy, and except a few of us who managed to be where we are, the economy basically looks like pre-1994. We still have oligopolies. The economy is still run by white males. The economy is still owned by white people. So you're wondering, but what was this government doing in 28 years? Did they actually do anything? And we think they didn't do much. They have not changed the economy. They haven't changed the structure. Look what they've done with the spectrum. Instead of opening the market and bring new entrants, they decided to give the spectrum to those who have. And I suspect even now, MTN wants to buy Vodacom. I'm sure they're going to allow it. And we're then going to be having MTN and Vodacom owning 90% of the economy. And we expect small business to participate and contribute anything. It's not going to happen. Because remember, most of the economic sectors are owned by 2 or 3 companies that own 90% or so. And then all of us who are sitting here, some of us who are sitting here, have to then compete for the 10% or the 5% that is left. And we expect to grow the economy. And then which leads me to the next question. Do we really have, as a country, have an economic policy? Because one has thought that the National Development Plan was our economic policy. And it said, if you want to deal with unemployment by 2030, and remember we're in 2022, by 2030, we should create 11 million jobs, and 90% of those jobs must come from small business. But the government is not doing anything to support small business. They're actually supporting big business. And you think we're going to be able to create jobs. I don't think it's going to happen. So I think the call for us is that us as professionals sitting in various places, the economy and our country is going down with us. And the question is that what is it that we're going to do about it? Our kids are going to blame us. Our kids are still going to fight the very same fight that we should have fought of making sure that the economy is transformed, that the economy is open to new players, and that is not happening. So the question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to sit and complain in Twitter, Facebook, and other social media? or are we going to be there and try and fight? I know most of the ones who are working for corporates, they are so scared that they can't even say black where they work. They rather say people of color. Yeah, I know most of the black people, even in summer, they'll be wearing jackets and you think it's because they want to be formal, but because they can't control the they can't control the aircon. So I think it's up to us, especially black professionals, to really do something, to take the power that is there. No one is going to give you the power. And force government to make sure that we open the economy. We cannot grow the economy where the majority of the firms who own the economy are like top 3, top 4, or top 2 in all the sectors. So we have to support the work of the Commission and make sure that we open the economy so that we can transform it. Because in our view, a transformed economy that is inclusive will create jobs and will grow the economy. Otherwise, we're going to face what we faced last year in July, and that may just happen and become a permanent future where the majority decide to render the economy and the country ungovernable. And the few of us who are staying in gated communities will be sitting there helpless. People coming and taking what we should have given them before. So it's up to us. I think I just basically want to say it's upon us to do something to transform the economy and open it to new entrants. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mataba. I mean, I'm going to come back, if there's time, a bit later to ask you kind of what are the issues and what needs to be done. Because I think it's also important, even as we stock take across the board about kind of the state of the economy as it is, it's no good if we're also not trying to think through what are the pathways moving forwards. Simon, you've spent years in the competition authorities, but of course together at CRED and trying to think through these challenges of black inclusion, of SMME inclusion, of broader opening up concentrated economic markets. And I think in many ways, in some of your writing, you speak of the idea of changing the rules of the game for inclusion in that as well. So perhaps a few remarks that kind of maybe set the scene, but also point forward in terms of key challenges and issues that need to be the focus of the authorities, but also policy more broadly as it relates to broader participation.
Thanks very much also to the Commission and Tribunal for the invite to be here. It's a great honor, great pleasure to be here today. I'm not sure if my clock on the computer is the same as everybody else's, but and the credibility of the timekeeping. But anyway, I'll carry on. I imagine I'm going to get cut off halfway through in preliminary remarks. I think where I wanted to start actually is trying to reflect on the major challenges and think through what does this mean for a changing regime going forwards in the context of incredible urgency. Because I think we've heard about the urgency in terms of the structure of the economy. We know about the urgency in terms of climate change, and there are things that we can learn about responding to it from COVID. I want to make one comment about the climate change thing, because actually we're living in a bubble at the moment in terms of climate change. The rains are good here. Food prices have not increased that much. If you are looking at, in Brazil, you're talking about a drought, the worst drought in 100 years. If you're talking about East Africa and Kenya, worst drought in 40 years. The impact on food prices was so substantial that the government, over the month of the election, halved the maize meal price just by a direct agreement with the millers. It was so dramatic, it was so important. So we are living at the moment in the kind of illusion of kind of, what's happening, looking at everything else. When the drought comes to Southern Africa, the shocks will be so substantial. And those shocks will have implications for markets. And so what I want to talk about is how we can think about how we have responded to the COVID pandemic and think about the shocks looking ahead. And that future is now. We have to do this very quickly. And we need a mobilization across society to do this. Now, it seems almost impossible to think about how this can happen in the context of the recent history. And I'm all in favor of opening up markets for informal sector activity, but I don't think this is going to move the dial in terms of the structure of the economy. So I'm not against it, but I think we need to think much further ahead. In terms of on what can be done, the Commission led the world in responding to the price gouging, taking advantage of short-term monopoly power, and responding to that with the tools that they had right then. I was working for the UK authority at the time. The UK authority was sitting on webinars, listening to Temikosi and James, talking about applying those tests and reading the decisions of the tribunal. Okay? The question is, how do we then build on this to rethink what we need to do for a markets regime? Because this was about rules for markets in that context. And a lot of other things, of course, have to happen along the way. But I'm going to talk about what we might be able to think about in terms of the market. I think there are two things that are happening already, in actual fact, that we need to recognize. First of all, is moving from thinking about a competition authority to what a markets authority looks like. And that's an authority that really takes up the market inquiry's findings, to be able to deal with things like barriers to entry, but to be able to act and not talk. So the other thing that's very interesting looking from the outside in a comparative context is that aside from the COVID thing, there's been actually a lot of action in other authorities around things like supermarkets. And there's not been action here. And so I think that's very important. If we move to a markets authority, we need to be able to take action on markets. And we need to think about the standards for healthy markets. And this is questioning the kind of the microeconomics paradigms that are used and how we evaluate that. And that's what I think we've seen in the excessive pricing, price gouging decisions. So that's when we've been developing these ideas at the research center, Tanda Directs that I work in as well. So we're happy to talk more about that. Okay, so I'm going to try and dip into a couple of things and give some examples there. So I'd foolishly, of course, started to think about preparing slides and then realized that it wasn't going to be that kind of thing. So I'm not so able to talk on the hoof as some of the other panel members are. So thinking about the major challenges to markets that we have, and these challenges are all here and all here right now, and not dealing with them is still is a choice. The high levels of concentration. In South Africa, these high levels of concentration have existed all the way through, and they've changed relatively little. Digital platforms have shown what that concentration looks like in other countries, other regimes, and we're seeing the responses to those high levels of concentration. The question it poses to us is what could be happening to deal with those high levels of concentration in other sectors of the economy? So when we look at it in the context of digital platforms, these are businesses which control and shape how we choose, consume products, the value creation that happens back through value chains, etc., the control over data. We have got a revolution taking place in antitrust. We've got amendments to laws, we've got new institutions being established. And those institutions recognize that, first of all, the regulatory bodies that exist in silos need to be broken down, because a telecoms regulatory body, a finance regulatory body, a consumer protection body, and a competition body, the platforms cut across all of that. So we have analog regulators in a digital world. And so if we're looking at how people consume products and how they make choices in the data, do we really want a consumer protection body which understands how consumers make choices, or should do, separate from a competition body? No, we want one body with data scientists. We want armies of data scientists to collect the data that exists in private hands to understand how people are making choices in close to real time. We need to do that now. South Africa has actually clusters of data scientists. Right? It's actually, they can be hired, and they can be trained, and they can be accelerated very, very rapidly. But other authorities are already doing this. So this is a road from which we can learn. Okay? When we think about the conduct of the companies does not fit into a pigeonhole. They don't do exclusive dealing here. They're doing all of these things all the time. I don't believe they're necessarily new theories of harm, but it's multidimensional. How are we able to deal with that? Well, we need to think about introducing the terminologies that we see in other countries. In the German law, designating companies that have got paramount significance for competition across markets. Okay? Paramount significance for competition across markets. That's not limited to digital platforms. There are companies here that have got paramount significance for competition across markets. In the UK wording, which has not been adopted by this government, and I doubt will be, it's about companies with strategic market status. Those companies are subject to different standards. Okay? Now, either we introduce those standards for companies that have got entrenched dominance, or we don't. And the amendments obviously introduce a whole lot of things, but I think the one thing I think we need to do is a reality check. The reality check of the past 2 decades is that it will be another decade before these amendments have been properly tested. We can't wait a decade, I don't think, to open up the economy. So opening the economy through these amendments, given the structure that we have, the legal contestation, etc., I think, I want somebody to tell me different, that the amendments will lead, and maybe the Commission will be very creative about it. I'm sure they will, in fact, but I do believe that we should be very concerned about how quickly that can happen. That's on the concentration side. On the barriers to entry and black economic empowerment side, I'm going to skate over this quickly. We worked on this a few years ago, and there's a book which actually is Opening the South African Economy, which is a series of case studies. And the insights from the case studies come up with some pretty straightforward insights, I think, and recommendations, which is that when you're opening up a sector, you need to do a number of things at once. You need to address things like access to finance, skills and capabilities, routes to market. Supermarkets are critical here. Critical infrastructure such as storage facilities. And you need to do all of those things at the same time. If you only address finance, but you don't open up the routes to market, you're setting up the black industrialists to fail. Right? And it's a package of at least, we characterize it as four main areas. If you can't get your products, you can produce the most wonderful product. If it's not on the shelf, you will fail. And here, Soweto Gold, the beer case is our test case. Master brewer trained at SAB. Brewery in Soweto, great brand, great beer. Packaging it and putting it on the bar top is essential. If you can't do that, you will fail. So bought out by Heineken. Right? What do we learn from that? We have to have that package, and it has to be relevant for particular sectors of the economy. So it's got to be based on the insights for those particular sectors. Strategies to open up. It's like a can opener to open up sectors of the economy to entrepreneurship. In terms of the COVID issues, I think this was really interesting in questioning the economic standards for excessive pricing and showing that we need to think about where that price incentive at the margin is not incentivizing entry, it's not incentivizing increased supply, it's just capturing a corner of the market. These insights are really important because climate change means that's going to happen much more. Right? Climate change means that you're going to have short-term supply shocks, and as we know from all the economists' work on famines, that means that people who can corner those markets can make these impacts much, much worse. It's a market tool that we need to do that. The impacts in South Africa, the work we're doing really points to these effects in East Africa being very, very dramatic right now, and I would urge you all to look at that because that is what will be happening in Southern Africa in time. And now I'm probably over time. I'm going to say 2 last things.
This is also I won't come back to you in the second round, so that's fine.
Okay, I'm done. Okay, I thought I'd better get it. The monopoly over the microphone for a short period, very transient period of time. So in terms of healthy markets, we need to think about standards which capture participation, the prices and returns which reward effort and innovation, and healthy choices for consumers. Right? We need to think about markets in terms of these different dimensions. We need to think about a set of institutions which are markets institutions, and that they set rules that shape markets in effective ways. A code of conduct for groceries, for example. This is not about being for or against supermarkets. All the supermarkets must be subject to the same code. And it should be a code which cuts across Southern Africa, which will make it more simple and straightforward for the large supermarkets, but imposes a set of rules which they can comply with around things like supplier development, opening up shelf space to black businesses and smaller businesses across the region. And then in terms of the tools of the authorities, the one thing I want to say is that I think in addition to the consumer data gathering, is the powers to be able to make decisions, make and enforce decisions, possibly with a no-fault finding, right? This is what we're seeing with digital platforms. You find markets aren't working without necessarily finding an abuse has taken place, and you rewrite the rules. If you like, it's like cricket. If we don't like the game we have, we change the game. It's the same for everybody, but we change it. And if we don't like it, we change it again.
Right.
Okay? And we need to think about this for our markets. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Simon. So the signal is that we are done for time, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to at least give the panelists a last shot. But it's going to be not so much in reflecting on the issues, but what is the one thing we need to then be doing, drawing from your work or your areas of expertise, that we need to focus on? Haroon, for instance, you introduced some ideas around innovation in the way we even think about inclusion as not being about households, but actually being about firms. What should we be doing, and is there a role here for regulators, competition agencies, and that? And then I'll go through the speakers, asking for that one nugget that we can all take home.
Yeah, I mean, so to some extent, it's predictably about switching from households in terms of policy support designed to create jobs, should be less about households, in fact, less about public sector employment and more about firms, and less about thinking of the private sector as listed entities that are large corporates, right? In the context that I'm thinking about, which is mass employment creation that's sustainable, you have to think of those at the bottom end of the firm size spectrum, survivalist firms in the informal sector, or poor households as potential firms.
Sure.
And if you design policy support for that, you can unlock growth, but I think you do definitely. I mean, the data is very clear. You move the dial on unemployment like no other growth strategy is going to.
Sure. That's the elevator pitch right there. Prof. Chris, the elevator pitch.
My view is that we need to really look at this issue of aggregate demand in the South African economy, because if we don't focus on that, what we are likely going to experience, and in fact we might be experiencing already, is capacity scrapping, where even our installed capacity that we had 10 years ago is getting scrapped, and our long-run capacity to supply gets constrained, and then we experience bottlenecks every time we stimulate the demand side. So we need to protect installed capacity. So if we don't really take this aggregate demand side seriously, we are going to shrink the economy further.
Sure. Right. Sobering. Mr. Mataban, the golden nugget that we should take away.
I think what we need is political will to open the market to new entrants. In a country that is a black majority, it's actually a shame that in 28 years we don't have a black-owned bank. Why can't we take African Bank and make it a black-owned bank? But that needs political will, which I think we lack as a country. Thanks.
Right. General Secretary, you can close us out.
Well, to me, until we change the structure of the South African economy, the whole idea of a competition will remain a myth. Until we address the massive structural deficiencies we inherited from the colonial era, which we've done absolutely nothing about in 28 years, about the concentration of wealth and ownership. The whole debate about market or free market economy becomes a myth. And let me just mention one or two important issues. In our country, as we speak, 10% of the population owns wealth, or 90%. 10% of the population owns 90% of the wealth of the country. Before you go anywhere, you're dead in the water. And that 10% we know is history and how it happened to be that 10%. There can be no competition in that context. And there can be no free market in that context. So if you don't address that issue of the concentration of wealth in just too few hands, you're dead. There's no competition. Because flowing from that, everything else looks like exactly that, like that. You must remain here and go to the restaurants at night. You will see that 90-10%. You must go to the streets around the bars here. You will see that. You must go to the JSC, the point that you are making. You will see that concentration of wealth. Until we address that as the main structural problem that we are facing, the poverty crisis, the landless crisis on the part of the black majority, and the fact that 28 years into democracy, you can only still define poverty, landlessness, propertylessness in racial terms, then everything else we speak about in competition becomes just a myth. So, and that's what I think we've got to be thinking about more. The issue of breaking down the monopolies and the issue of ensuring that there is real competition on an equal footing between all people of this country. Currently, there isn't. And currently, and I'm coming from the other side of the equation in class terms, but also where I was born and what I regard to as my home. There isn't such a thing. You go there and have a competition commission talk, nobody will come. But you go there and talk about the access to roads, everybody will come. And until we address that issue, that's a structural issue, we're going nowhere. We can continue to have nice discussion, and we will applaud you. By the way, we must lobby you that you become the next public protector, because there's a vacancy there, isn't it?
Thank you.
The position is vacant as we speak, and the current one is not giving me any confidence whatsoever. The active one, or the deputy. So until we use every instrument that we have, in particular the Competition Commission, the Office of the Public Protector as a Chapter 9 institution, and everything else, a consumer organization that have teeth, a strengthened labor movement that have real teeth, because currently everybody is walking on a free park because the labor movement have been weakened. And, I can go on and on and on.
As you say it.
Yeah. So I think to me those are the few issues that I wanted to mention if we want to move from where we are into at least a different direction. Thank you very much.
So I'm actually scared to speak. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for your time, and I think for an engaging set of ideas that hopefully kickstarts some rigorous discussion for the rest of this conference. MC, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tando. That's why I didn't want to do this thing, Babujwa. No, you did. You did. It's just that Mr. Vavi and his wanton ways. Of course, it was a very important discussion to discuss the issues that remain a challenge, and of course, this would have had to have been the first session. I'm going to get to it. We are right now a full hour behind schedule. Somehow, I have to cover that. And I will cover that. So please work with me. This is now not me who was delayed. I was here at 8:15. We started a whole hour and 15 minutes after because it was you who was greeting each other out there. I asked for a 10-minute break. It became a 30-minute break. So we're just going to be a little more stringent. We're going to take a lunch break now for 35 minutes. Please. Ayabonga Tawe is here. He is on brief. We will start, cross my heart, hope to die, at 13 hours 10 with the next session. That's a 35-minute lunch break. And during the course of the day, we're going to chisel 10 minutes of each session with the hope that we can cover that time. The dinner is not here. It is at a different venue in Houghton. This is happening during peak hour traffic. If you look at your program, it's very ambitious to suggest we can move from here to Houghton in 15 minutes. These are the things I equally have to contemplate. So please work with me. It's lunch break now. 35 minutes later, we start. Ngos. There are 2 floors for the lunch. There are 2 levels for lunch. One where, just outside here, 1 level down is another lunch venue. Let's distribute ourselves. 2 levels for lunch. This level and 1 below. Behind the escalators, just turn left and you will see the venue. Thank you.